So, greetings, everyone. I'm Dr. Jenny Neville. I'm from Royal Holloway, University of London, and on behalf of myself and my colleague, Dr. Megan Cavell from the University of Birmingham. Now, Megan is here, but she's on an unstable connection, so she can't actually appear, but she is here. I'd like to welcome you on on behalf of both of us to today's seminar. And this event is coming out of our AHRC project, which is entitled Group Identity and the Early Medieval Riddle Tradition. And if you're interested, you could find out more about this project on the website entitled The Riddle Ages. It's a great website. Just type in The Riddle Ages and you'll get there. And you'll find there, for example, recordings of our last year's seminar series, which was on early medieval identities. You'll find recordings from this year's series, including this one once it's ready. And also watch this space for notice of Riddle Quest, which is an escape room to be located at Sutton Hoo. We're very excited to and looking forward to that quite soon. But for today, we're continuing our Riddles in Conversation series. The Exeter Book Riddles were left frustratingly, or as I like to think, delightfully unsolved in their 10th century manuscript. And they're often used to explain what we think we know about early medieval culture, but the truth is that they're much better at asking questions than they are giving answers. So in this seminar series, we're putting the Exeter Book Riddles in conversation with different kinds of knowing. And our conversation today is with Sharif Adams, who specializes in ancient wood turning techniques, some of which date from the Iron Age. So I'm going to share my screen now. Can everyone see the slides okay? Can you see the slides, Sharif? Yeah,
yes,
great.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to introduce Sharif. Now, Sharif uses a traditional foot-powered pole lathe to turn wooden bowls, pots, cups, flasks, and boxes. I'll just have a picture of that here, I hope. There we go. And for more than 10 years, he's been helping to keep this traditional craft alive by offering regular classes in all aspects of pole lathe turning. So Sharif, can you start us off by telling us how you came to wood turning and tell us a little bit about your journey thus far with the craft?
Yes, thank you, Jenny. And just want to start by saying thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this. I'm really excited when I read the riddle and for bringing the riddle to my attention as well. So I've been a wood turner now for about 12 years and a teacher. I work from a workshop on Dartmoor. My journey kind of started when I met Robin Wood, who at the time was the only person in this country who was a full-time production turner using a traditional foot-powered pole lathe to make wooden bowls and plates. I was very inspired and determined to learn the craft. I started writing a blog on about my journey learning and later teaching, and started running courses and workshops to share what I was learning with other people. At the time, the Heritage Craft Association had pole lathe bowl turning was listed as critically endangered on their red list. And it's recently been reclassified as currently viable, which just goes to show how much interest there has been over the last decade, which is continuing to grow. There are now plenty of teachers around the country and around the world teaching pole lathe bowl turning. And we've got a festival that happens here every year now called the Bowl Gathering, where people come from various different cultures to learn about this craft over a week. And so it's been an interesting journey to see how things have changed with this interest. And so that's kind of where I started and where I'm at now. Just another thing of interest, not far from my Dartmoor workshop, in 2011, there was a burial chamber discovered, which contained the remains, cremated remains of a female. And among other things, there were 4 lathe-turned ear studs found there. And that is the earliest example of wood turning ever discovered in this country. These lathe studs were turned from spindle wood. And a friend of mine, somebody I know who's been researching and studying wood turning his whole life, was called in to show how these would have been turned using Bronze Age tools. But I might mention that later when I talk about Stuart King.
Thank you. That's great. Now in this seminar, sorry, is that?
Yeah, no, I'm
over?
done. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Okay, yeah. So in this seminar, we would like to hear about how your extensive experience can help us reflect on Exeter Book Riddle 56. Now, this is a riddle that's traditionally associated with the creation of textiles and solved as a loom, but we think that it may actually disguise the processes of the once familiar craft of wood turning. So I'm going to read out the riddle now. Ich was tharinne, tharich anna jesech winnende wicht, widow benegian, holt huerfende. I was inside where I saw a single thing, a struggling creature, harm a wooden thing, a turning piece of wood. Heather glemma feng, deathrag dolga, derethas weren whale thar wichta, on say a wudu serwam fasta yabunden. It received battle gashes, deep wounds. Spears were a source of woe to the creature, and the wood was skillfully, securely bound. Hirafota was bead fast other bisio drag, leelk on lifta, wheelum londaneach. Of its 2 feet, the one was fixed. The other took part in labor. It flew up, sometimes in the air, sometimes near the land. Trea was Yetenga, tham ther torchten stod, leavam behongen. A tree was near to it, where it stood, beautiful, hung about with leaves. Ich lafa jesech, minam lafwore, thar haleth drunken, thar a flana je werk, on flet beren. I saw the leavings, the work of the arrows, carried onto the floor to my lord, where the warriors drank. So just put it up here on the screen, full translation. I'm just going to read through it quickly, just so we've all got the details in our head. So here's the story. I was inside where I saw a single struggling creature wound a wooden thing, a turning piece of wood. It received battle gashes, deep wounds. Spears were a source of woe to the creature, and that wooden thing was securely bound with skill. One of its feet was fixed, the other took part in labor. It flew up, sometimes into the air, sometimes near the land. A tree hung about with leaves was nearby it, where that beautiful thing stood. I saw the leavings, the work of the arrows, carried onto the floor to my lord, where the warriors drank. So Sharif, what does that riddle suggest to you as a craftsman?
Well, to me, it's really obvious what it's describing. And not just because I've been doing what I do for over a decade, but I was talking to someone yesterday who's not done so much, but also came to very similar conclusions that I came to. So I think, like you said, in a culture where people are aware of pole lathes, they know them as a common object, I think most people would recognize that very easily. This is you can see on your screen now a picture of me working in the woods on a traditional pole lathe set up in a very traditional way with the actual pole as the spring mechanism. I should really say that if you're interested in really learning about the history of lathes and wood turning, especially wooden bowls and hollow form vessels, there's a great book by Robin Wood called The Wooden Bowl, and that goes into a lot more of the history. But just to say very briefly that the lathe that you're looking at now is kind of the end of a long evolution. You know, an actual lathe, lathes have been described as earliest mankind's first machine tool. And the very first original lathes were very simple lathes called strap lathes operated by 2 people. So in its kind of most basic form, a lathe is a tool for turning wood or shaping wood, which spins between 2 centers. And then the person shaping the wood will use tools while it spins to shape the wood. The earliest form, a strap lathe, was operated by somebody standing opposite the turner, using a strap to make the piece of wood spin between the centres. And then it became bow lathes. So the turner himself would use something like a bow and arrow kind of bow, moving backwards and forwards to make the workpiece spin. And then later on, a pole like this was used with a treadle mechanism. So when the turner steps on the treadle, pushes down, that bends the pole, which makes the strap revolve around the drive shaft, which is called the mandrel, which is in turn hammered into the blank, the bowl or whatever that's being turned. So as the turner pushes down with his treadle, the workpiece spins. When the turner lifts his foot up, it spins the other way. So it's very different to modern machine lathe, electric lathes, which constantly rotate in one direction. A pole lathe is a reciprocating lathe. It goes backwards and forwards, which perfectly describes the struggling creature, this sort of backwards and forwards movement. So if I was to describe, let's say, shall I go on to talk through the actual riddle now in relation to this image and some of the other images? Shall I start doing that now?
Sure. Do you want me to move on to the next slide? Or
yeah,
do you want to? Yeah.
Well, I can't remember what the next slide is actually, but
it's you indoors with your lathe.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that. Yeah, that's great. So this is a kind of slightly relevant point actually, that the riddle starts by saying, I was inside where I saw a wooden thing. Now, in more recent times, kind of around about the 20th century, pole lathes were used, especially around High Wycombe, in the furniture making industry. And at that time, the people who were making the parts for the chairs would set up their camps in the beech woodlands and do all of their turning under the trees. But what we know historically about production turners who would have been turning bowls is that they didn't tend to work outside. They used to work, they would work in a workshop for various reasons. It would be easier to get large timbers delivered to the same place each time, outside a workshop. And a lot of the cores, the remains from the inside of the bowls and the cups were found in certain places. It suggests a kind of an industry. So that's the first point, is that turners would have worked inside. And you can see here, again, I've got my one foot on the ground in this image and another foot on the treadle, just about to push down and make the workpiece spin just before taking a cut. You can see on my lathe and in my hand, I'm holding the turning tools, which we now call hook tools. They're long metal tools with a cutting edge at the end with a slightly curled tip. And you can see one of those on the lathe, one of those in my hands. This is a perfect image now that you're showing of the tools. And they're all different shapes for different reasons, different things that you turn. But generally speaking, they're a long shank set into a long wooden handle with a sharp cutting edge at the very tip. And so, the riddle goes on to describe spears and that wooden thing securely bound with skill were the cause of harm to the creature. Now, you can clearly see in this image that the cord, I should also point out that on this particular pole lathe, we've got two uprights and there's a bit of bungee cord. So instead of using a pole, which is very difficult to anchor into, to fix into the ground in a workshop like this, I just used two uprights with a bungee cord to give me the same spring mechanism that traditionally a wooden pole would have been used for. There are examples of people working inside still using poles which are attached in various different ways, either coming out the side of a wall or attached to beams on the roof. But yeah, so that's but what you can see here is that the leather strap, the cord, the drive strap, which is attached at one end to the treadle and at the other end to the bungee cord, or what would have been the springy pole, is wrapped around a round cylindrical piece of wood called a mandrel. And that is a piece of wood that's got spikes at one end, metal spikes or tangs. And that, before anything happens at all, that gets hammered into the piece of wood that's going to become the bowl, so that it's attached to it. And then the mandrel and the blank attached together are mounted in between the two metal centers on the headstock and the tailstock, those big blocks of wood on the bed of the lathe. And then the cord is wrapped around that mandrel. I think if you go to the next slide somewhere, there's a picture of a mandrel. There's some more hook tools there. There you go. So that's a couple of the mandrels that I use. You can see they've got quite nasty, vicious spikes or metal tangs at one end to make sure that they go into the bowl blank and stay securely fixed there. If they start to wobble loose, everything turning a bowl just won't be possible, because you need it all to be completely fixed and stable to get a true cut. If at any point those mandrel tangs start to kind of work loose, everything gets uncentered on the lathe, and you'll never be able to get a perfect cut with the tool. So it's really important that they are able to stay firmly, securely attached. So going back to the riddle, spears and that wooden thing securely bound with skill were the cause of harm to the creature. So if we say that the creature is the piece of wood that's being turned, the blank that's going to become the bowl, the cause of harm to that creature are spears or the turning tools, and that wooden thing securely bound with skill. So I think that the wooden thing securely bound with skill that's being referred to is a mandrel. It needs to be, this is a picture of how it's bound on with the drive strap. Now, the way that the drive strap is wrapped around the mandrel is not irrelevant. If it's wrapped around the wrong way, when the turner pushes down on the treadle, the blank will spin the wrong way, so the tool will just rub harmlessly against the blank as it spins away from the cutting edge. So it needs to be wrapped correctly, so that as the turner pushes down on the treadle, the workpiece spins against the cutting edge, and that's when the shavings start to fly and the bowl gets shaped by the cutting tool. If the mandrel and the bowl blank are not centered perfectly correctly between the two metal centers on the lathe, as it spins, it will be going up and down very eccentrically. There'll be a lot of eccentric movement up and down, which will make it impossible to get a true cut and make turning difficult. So setting up the mandrel, if somebody was watching a wood turner using a pole lathe to turn a bowl, the first thing they will see is the turner hammering in with a wooden mallet, hammering the mandrel spikes into the bowl blank. So it's quite a violent thing to witness. And then they'll see the turner take the mandrel, which is attached to the bowl blank, and very, very carefully take a bit of time to offer it up to those two metal centers on the lathe and make sure that it is spinning perfectly true, that it's not going up and down, not wobbling. It needs to be centered really nicely. They'll then see the turner fix that poppet in place so that it's all held, and wrap the drive strap very carefully around the mandrel. So I think this second part of the riddle is describing that whole process really, really well.
Sure. Can I just stop you there for a second, Sharif?
Yeah.
I wonder, I mean, you've explained that really clearly, but for those of us who've never held those tools or even, encountered the word mandrel before, I wondered whether we could just have a pause here and see if anybody had any questions. You want to pop a question in the chat? Is there anything that you'd like Sharif to explain in more detail? Just let me know which slide you'd like me to show. But if people could, maybe I'll stop sharing. No, I won't stop sharing. Can I see the chat when I'm sharing? Are there any questions? No, that's all right for everybody? Great. Okay. I will share my screen again. Okay. Sorry, Sharif. I hope I didn't interrupt your flow too much.
No, not at all. Not at all. Thank you. I'm glad you did that. I know there's a couple of people I can see on the screen there that know exactly what I'm talking about anyway, because Adrian and Tad are both wood turners as well, using pole lathes. So, so the next thing, so moving forward, Oh, the other thing, going back to the very beginning, I was inside where I saw a wooden thing, a wandering timber wound a single struggling creature. I did wonder about whether the wooden thing that's being described there is the actual lathe itself. But reading it again, in relation to what I'm saying about the mandrel, I wonder, I was in where I saw a wooden thing, a wandering timber. I wondered what wandering timber means. And in terms of the mandrel wounding a single struggling creature, the mandrel is really the only part of the lathe which detaches. So if you look at the lathe as a machine, an entire machine, the mandrel is like a wandering timber. It can come off the lathe, it gets hammered into the blank, and then it gets mounted back onto the lathe. It's like a separate part in a way. So I did wonder if that's what that was describing. But anyway.
Well, maybe I'll just come in here quickly and just to
Yeah.
say, and this is something Craig might be thinking about too, because he's worked with these texts for a long time, is that my translation had to make decisions about what was happening at this point. And maybe we can talk about it later, but there is a real question about what which part is the wooden thing and what the wooden thing is doing to what here. So there is ambiguity here, which I think would work really well with a riddle, but leaves you as the person who's operating the machine wondering which part of it is, I think. Yeah. Sure,
that's really interesting. Yes, because I've been kind of reading this through a lot and getting myself tied up into knots about what is literal, what is kind of metaphorical. I mean, you, in one of your original emails to me, you said, you know, that with riddles, you use this sentence where you said phrases and words may be used to camouflage or disguise the reality of the object. And I know that happens a lot with riddles, but I wondered to what degree is all of it being disguised, or is some of it literal? But anyway, so it's just, these are just sort of thoughts that I'm sharing as they kind of come to me, really. So moving on, one of its feet was fixed. The other took part in labour. It flew up into the air and sometimes near the land. So so there's lots of, I mean, there's various things this could be referring to. The obvious first thing that you might think of is the actual pole itself, which certainly in an outside setting, like you can see in the woods here, the farthest away part of the pole is anchored into the ground with like a cross frame of other two pieces of wood and a couple of stakes. And then so one of the feet is fixed, the other took part in labour. So at one end it's fixed in the ground, the other end goes up and down as the turner pushes up and down on the treadle. So that's the most obvious striking image that comes to you. But obviously, if you're inside, it's much less easy to set up the pole in that way, because you can't hammer stakes into the ground, depending what the floor's made of. It could be an earthen floor, I suppose. But just to say that the other possibility is that the one of its feet being fixed, the other taking part in labour, could actually be the treadle. So on my treadle here, you can see at the one part of the treadle, this plank of wood, is fixed to a big block of wood, and that doesn't move anywhere. The other end goes up and down, again, in time with the turner's foot, sometimes near the... Now, the reason I thought it might be the treadle rather than the pole is that it says it flew up into the air and sometimes near the land. Now, the pole certainly does fly up in the air, but it doesn't really come anywhere near the land, as in near to the ground. It stays around about sort of shoulder height at its lowest point. Whereas the treadle does fly up into the air, and as the turner pushes his foot down, it comes right down near to the ground. I mean, it's even possible to push it so that it hits the ground each time, although that's not something you would want to do. But it's so it kind of describes the treadle to me, I think, probably more accurately. But again, I'm talking about more literal kind of interpretations of the actual experience of using the lathe. Now, moving on through the riddle, the thing that really puzzled me, up until this point, I was like, yeah, okay, this is describing a pole lathe. It makes perfect sense, you know, literally and kind of a bit more metaphorically. It all kind of, you can riddle it to make sense. Then it says, a tree hung about with leaves was near to it where that beautiful thing stood. So my first thought was, okay, are they talking about an actual tree? You know, is this, but because we know this is happening inside, it's not, if it was a lathe set up in the forest, that would make perfect sense. But we're being told at the beginning that this is inside. So what could this tree hung about with leaves near to the lathe be? And the first thing that occurred to me was, generally speaking, when you're working with a pole lathe, traditionally we use green wood or unseasoned wood, freshly felled wood. Modern power lathe turners using electric lathes use seasoned wood because they don't want their bowls to distort or warp as they dry. But using an electric lathe with all that power, you can turn very hard seasoned wood. Wood is much harder when it's dry. When the wood has just been freshly cut, it contains a relatively high moisture content, which means that with simple hand tools, whether carving by hand with a knife or using a traditional foot-powered lathe where your own body is driving the machine, it's much easier to cut wood that is green or unseasoned. In other words, it's got a high moisture content. So that's traditionally how a lot of all the old bowls and cups and drinking vessels that we found that have survived, you can see the movement as these items have dried. So we know that they were turned with wood that wasn't fully seasoned. They dried and seasoned once they had been turned. And, you know, there's a very simple reason for that. Like I said, it's just easier to do that. So I did wonder if the tree hung about with leaves being near to the lathe was a literal tree trunk that had been dragged in, still with branches with green leaves on it, which the turner would then be sawing bits off, shaping them with an axe into a blank before mounting to the lathe, which is entirely possible. In my own workshop, I've had lumps of wood like that with buds and leaves and, you know, still on it because it's been so freshly cut. Thinking about it a bit more though, you know, the fact that it could be, like you said, not such a literal translation, but the tree hung about with leaves being near to it could be more of a kind of metaphorical, you know, something that's been disguised. Made me think, and this, reading something that Megan had written, Megan's written about this being a loom, although she told me just a few minutes ago she's now you know, pretty sure that it's actually a pole lathe. She's more convinced now that it's a pole lathe, but she had written quite a lot about how it was, the solution was a loom in something called Looming Danger and Dangerous Looms that she'd written. And in there she quoted something by a guy called John Niles, who from something he'd written in Old English enigmatic poems. And he says, rarely is the raw stuff of nature, if this is talking about riddles, rarely is the raw stuff of nature introduced, such as an ox's hide, without it being brought into relation to the cooked elements of culture, i.e. a set of leather goods. The riddles then domesticate the elements of nature and turn them into human use. So using that, my understanding of what John Niles was saying about how this is done in riddles, a tree hung about with the leaves was near to it. Doesn't necessarily need to be an actual tree hung about with leaves. Now, one thing that you get in production wood turning, bowl turning, is two elements. You've got the roughing out the bowls. So you're taking pieces of wood and rough shaping them with an axe, more or less bowl shaped, before you hammer in the mandrel and get them on the lathe and then turn them. To do that, you need a chopping block of some sort. You can see in this image here, in the left corner of the image, there is an axe lying against a big round block of wood. Now, I don't use a chopping block like that. I actually use one that's on 3 legs. But I have seen people, and it's perfectly feasible. And some of the old photographs of George Lely, or George Lely's brother, who was known as the last bowl turner in this country, his brother used to rough out his bowl blanks for him. There is a chopping block exactly like that big round of wood, but higher. So it's at sort of waist height. So it's the same height a farrier would have an anvil, say, for example, a comfortable height to be axing. And there would be an awful lot of work done with the axe on the chopping block to prepare the bowl blanks. Now, when you are using an axe to rough out a bowl blank, you don't get shavings like there are now, under these curly shavings under my lathe. They come off the cutting tool when you're turning the bowl, you get these long ribbons and curly shavings, very, very fine shavings. With the axe work, what you get are kind of wafer thin or sometimes thicker than, relatively thick slivers of wood, which are, about leaf shaped, say, the size of a leaf, and you get a lot of those over the chopping block and sort of littered all around the chopping block. So I wonder if an image of a production bowl turner in a workshop would have the lathe there, and standing next to the lathe, there would be a chopping block. A tree hung about with leaves was near to it. So this tree hung about with leaves could be just a big section of a large diameter tree trunk scattered with the remnants of the axe work. That image really makes sense in my mind. But again, it depends whether it's literal or words being used to disguise the reality of that object. So then moving on from there, I saw the leavings, the work of the arrows carried onto the floor to my lord, where the warriors drank. Now, the word leavings here is kind of tricky. As you were saying, Jenny, it's kind of ambiguous, and there are various different definitions, aren't there, of a possible interpretation of the word leavings. So it could be that it's a status object, which you said is often used as that, the word leavings. So it could be that this person saw the leavings, and the leavings are the status object or an item that has just been turned, a drinking vessel, a wooden bowl, a cup of some sort, a goblet perhaps. The work of the arrows carried onto the floor to my lord, where the warriors drank. It could be as simple as that the turner has finished turning a goblet, a drinking vessel, and it's now been carried from the lathe down to a hall where there's a big drinking sort of session taking place. On the other hand, because it's so ambiguous, this word leavings, leavings just suggests what's left behind. So if you can see in this image here of me turning, there's a huge amount of material left when you're turning a lot of bowls. I have sacks and sacks of it up at one end of my workshop, and it gets used. The farmer where my workshop is will periodically come and take all of these sacks out of the workshop, and he'll put them into his cow sheds in the winter to help mop up all of the muck and the slurry in the cow sheds. When I was living in the woods off grid for a few years, as part of a woodland community, the shavings that I produced on my lathe were very valuable because they were all collected up and they were put into the compost toilets, where they would be perfectly used to scatter into the compost toilets after you'd been to the toilet. So what I'm trying to say is the whole time I've been doing what I do, my shavings have always been used and useful in one way or another. So it's entirely possible, I don't know, it's really, really plausible that these shavings would have been very useful in various different ways back in the day as well. And to imagine that a feasting hall where warriors are drinking, and obviously lots of drunken antics going on, there would have been spillages and all sorts of mayhem, that it would have been a great idea to put these shavings down on the floor to help to mop up the mess. So it could be quite a literal thing. I saw the leavings, the work of the arrows carried onto the floor to my lord, where the warriors drank. Kind of makes sense. So you've got some pictures here of the Sutton Hoo. These are some cups from the Sutton Hoo examples. One, I think, as you said, it's a replica, and the one on the left, isn't it? That's one of the originals. And there were these kind of globular drinking vessels in Saxon times that were very popular. I mean, the Saxons were great drinkers. It was a wood culture. And they were big drinkers. So, there's this, you said that it's difficult to put an actual date on it, but that you think this riddle is around about 10th century. And,
the manuscript is for sure, yeah.
The manuscript, okay.
But
so sorry, go on.
I was sort of going, when the actual poem was written, we don't know, but the manuscript definitely in the 10th century. Yeah.
Okay. So you know, it's quite possible that it makes sense in terms of the dates that, you know, that's when all of these drinking vessels were being used and were very popular. In Robin's book, he talks about the Coppergate cups. There was this fantastic find of kind of Scandinavian, you know, the largest, I think, Viking age find of turned vessels from Coppergate in York were discovered. This is like going back again 10th century, around the 10th century, and a lot of the vessels that were found were among bowls, but there were lots and lots of cups as well that were discovered, and the cores turned from that were left as remains from cups being turned there. So yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of things, other things that I could mention. You know, there's the way that these cups would have been turned very often, or were turned, was the orientation of the wood is different to how bowls would have been turned, and they would have been turned in such a way that the fibers of the wood, it's called end grain turning, the fibers of the wood would have been running up the length of the cup, and they were often turned from round wood rather than large diameter wood, which just means that it's very likely that there would have been quite a lot of leakage, potentially. I mean, you know, end grain can leak through end grain cups can leak, which is why people who are turning end grain cups now are trying all sorts of things. Some people use wax to seal the end grain. Other people more recently have been using a Japanese form of lacquer called urushi, which seals the wood. But it's a fact that end grain cups can have a propensity to kind of leak. And it might be something that back in the day when the Saxons were drinking, they weren't worried about some of their ale leaking through the bottom of their cups. But you know, if that's the case, and it would have just added to this kind of wet, sloshy environment of beer all over the place, not just from them getting drunk and spilling it, but because it was leaking out of the cups to some degree. So shavings on the floor would have been a great idea. You know, but going back to that again, I mean, that other idea is that end grain cups do work best when they are kept wet. So I've got end grain cups here in my house, and I know that if I leave them for several months without using them, they're much more likely to leak or crack when I eventually pour water back into them. Whereas as long as they're in constant use, the fibers tend to swell when they're wet and help to stop any of that leakage. So it's an interesting thing. The more they're being used, the better they are. And it does kind of also make sense. The work of the arrows carried onto the floor to my lord where the warriors drank. I was wondering, would that be carried onto the floor when? After the turning? Was the person witnessing it seeing the item made carried on later on to the lord where the warriors drank? But it seems to suggest that this is all happening, it's being turned, and then he sees it carried onto the floor straight away. And I kind of thought to myself, well, that would make sense, really. If end grain cups, drinking vessels, work better when they've still got a kind of moisture content, either through constant use or having just been freshly turned, there's no reason why, rather than sealing it with, what people tend to do now is they let their cups dry very carefully, then seal with them with wax or some other way of sealing, oil, whatever they're using. But why not turn the cup straight away and use it straight away? They might actually work better that way, and that's maybe what's being described.
That's fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Do you have more things you want to say about the cups now? I was just wondering whether we could turn over to some questions from our audience now. But again,
I think there's one last thing I'd like to say. I spoke to Stuart King earlier, who's my friend who I used to know from when I lived in Hertfordshire. I just run this riddle by him and wanted to get some thoughts. And one of the things he said, you know, I had questions like the word spears, for example. And I know that it could be just sort of, you know, a way of describing the reality of the word. But Stuart mentioned that he had seen a number of medieval engravings which depict a wood turner. This is an image that he just sent me. The wood turner as an angel turning, using a turning tool, which is a spear, and the angel is turning a sphere, which is the world. And Stuart was telling me this is quite common in some medieval engravings, and especially some Christian artifacts, this image, and suggesting that God created the world on the lathe, and it's often an angel that's seen working on the lathe. There's a lot of Christian imagery here. So you've got the treadle is a crucifix. The spear, obviously, the spear in Jesus's side as he was hung on the crucifix. You got the bulrush up here, which is the pole. You know, there's a lot of Christian symbolism and imagery here, but reading back through this riddle again after seeing this image, there are so many things that describe that, especially this bit at the end. I saw the leavings, the work of the arrows carried onto the floor to my lord where the warriors drank. So if the leavings are the shavings here that are flying off the item that's being turned, carried onto the floor to my lord, literally underneath the shavings on the floor there, the treadle is the crucifix. Now, you said to me that this is a much, much later image than the riddle. The riddle predates this image. But like Megan says, it's possible then that this image, it probably isn't, but it just, the thought, you know, comes to you, well, has this image been born out of this riddle, perhaps? There's lots of interesting questions. Anyway, I don't know the answers to most of them, but it's been fascinating to read through this riddle and sort of mull it all over and try to kind of come up with some suggestions for you.
No, that's fascinating, and I love this. There's so much detail that you've given us that help us to think about the language of the riddle in new ways. But this image at the end takes it to another level, and you start thinking, "Oh my goodness, is this an allegory of creation?" Yeah, and the idea of God as craftsman. But I'd love to hear from some of our other people who are here today, if I can remember how to stop sharing, see if there are any questions or comments for what we've already heard from Sharif. Thank you very much. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, or Craig, are you ready? You're right, go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, I just had a couple of comments here. At the end of the poem, there is at the end of the riddle, there is this notion that the tree is brightly hung with leaves. So the wood doesn't seem to be bright, so that's, I think, a problem. But the word torch can actually mean splendidly or magnificently or wildly or weirdly. So I think that would possibly solve that problem.
Would you like me to put the text back up on the screen? Would that be helpful for people?
Yeah, that would be.
Yeah, okay. I won't be able to see the chat then once I'm sharing my screen, but people can just shout and then.
I'll handle the chat, Jenny.
Okay, thank you. I'll put that back up and go back to, well, people can tell me what they want to see. I'll go back to the full translation of the text there. And if people want me to go back to the Old English text, just say. So go ahead, Craig, with your other point.
The remnant. So the lava, which is the remnant, what's left over. I would just say that there's a common phrase, hamara lava, which translates literally as the results of forging, meaning the swords in Old English poetry. And I think that might be in play here somehow, that it's referring not to the leavings that are on the ground as opposed to the thing that's being carved, but to the thing that's being carved or forged itself. What's left over after the carving, or what's left over after the forging. That's all.
Thank you.
I feel like it's playing with that, but sorry, I just jumped in. I feel like it's playing with that, but in order to intentionally subvert it. So the leavings here, the work of arrows. Yeah, I think there is an echo of the leavings of hammers, But I think that it's inverting that and saying this is the wooden artifact rather than the sword. If that makes sense.
I don't know. What do you think, Sharif?
I think it's really ambiguous and open to so much interpretation. That last sentence is kind of problematic. I think it's out of all of it. It gets a bit more tricky for me at the end, trying to understand. I mean, if it's just as simple as like Craig was saying, what's left being the bowl or the cup. It's just really obvious, but then why would the rest of the riddle be so kind of disguised and camouflaged and the very end be so much more obvious? It's weird. You know, the forgings thing is interesting as well, because turners would often make their own tools, you see. So when you mention forging and making, I wondered if there's some element, are they talking about the tool, the forge being used there somehow as well to make the tools? I don't know. You know, when he says the Lord and where the warriors drank, are the warriors actually people? If in the riddle they're describing, you know, it depends how kind of complicated you want to make it and mysterious and tricky you want to make it. But if they're describing the tools as spears and arrows, then perhaps the warriors are the actual craftsmen, not actual warriors who are fighting in battle, but maybe it's like a real common place for the craftsmen to go and drink at the end of the day. Maybe the Lord isn't a lord as such, but there's somebody's boss, you know. I don't know. I mean, there's all sorts of interpretations, aren't there? That's what's so fascinating about it, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to submit that what is really obvious to you as the person who's used the tool might not have been so obvious. Oh, it certainly has not been obvious to modern readers. I think you're probably right that this tool would have been a lot more familiar to people in previous ages where everything was made out of wood. But the, as you say, the ambiguity at the end, I think is enough for someone to play with, so that it's not out of keeping with the ambiguity of the rest of the text. Somebody else have a hand up?
I'll just read a comment from the chat, Jenny, which from Jane. I love the elegant simplicity of this reading. And whilst I'm talking, I may as well have added something of my own, which was to bring you back, Sharif, to that image at the very end that your colleague sent to you. This riddle has been read as a kind of martyr riddle. I think Dieter Bitterly wrote that in his book. So it has been linked to the crucifixion, well, to martyrdom, and then to the crucifixion as well. So that works really nicely with that image of the angel creating the earth and the crucifix use in there. I think it's definitely possible to read really explicit Christian imagery into this, and it has been done, which is great.
Interesting. That's very interesting. I'm so grateful to Stuart for I don't know if Stuart's still, he said he wouldn't be able to stay for the whole thing, but I don't know if you can see if Stuart King is here and whether he'd like to share any thoughts on this. He might have had to go already.
I can't see him.
There's another interesting point about bringing the leaving to the table, which is that if there's this reverberation with the swords, there are lots of Anglo-Saxon laws and passages which say you cannot bring your swords to the table because people would get drunk and have arguments at the table, and it sometimes would end up in huge fights. So one nice irony at the end of this riddle, and I do think this is the right answer to the riddle, is that you can't bring your swords to the table, but your cups you can bring to the table.
I like it.
Yeah. It's nice.
I have one other question to ask of Sharif. So to think about riddles not from the point of view of people trying to solve them, but of people writing them, you always have an idea when you write a riddle to start with, and you start in with it, but you don't always know where it's going. And you use things that are literal and things that are metaphoric. And in the process of making the riddle, you shift its shapes sometimes because it's part of the creative process. So I just wonder, when you're using a lathe and shaping a bowl or shaping something, do you have the kind of freedom to change what's going on because of the way the shape is looking, or an idea you have? Or do you have a plan right from the beginning and hold literally to the plan?
That's a good question. I think when I started my journey learning how to turn on the pole lathe, I didn't have the freedom to, I didn't really have a plan in terms of design and form. It was more just about learning the technique and how to make a cut that was clean and nice rather than raspy and scratchy and leaving a rough finish. I was trying to kind of get the technical stuff down, but certainly now I have forms with I make standard eating bowls, which are now a kind of form which is always evolving slightly, but certainly for the last few years has been a very kind of fixed form. I don't know if I've got one here actually. You know, this is one of my standard eating bowls, and so when I make these bowls now, I offer them for sale. They pretty much all look the same. I'm able to kind of dictate where the curves are, you know, how wide they are, what happens with the rim, all these little shapes. You know, so yeah, I've got a plan now with things that I make, and I've certainly got the freedom, because I've been kind of, you know, doing this for a while now, to create the shapes that I want with the wood. Sometimes you have to let the wood dictate. Sometimes I'll be turning a bowl and there'll be a hidden knot, something that I couldn't see when I was roughing out the blank, but as I start to hollow it, a knot becomes apparent close to the rim. Now, if I was to leave that knot on the rim, the chances are that that would kind of start to crack and split as the bowl dries. So I then, halfway through the turning process, will have to kind of change my design slightly and alter things so that I turn that knot away and maybe make the bowl smaller, or maybe make the rim more cupped, so I avoid that part. So some of the times the wood dictates what's happening, but certainly once you've learnt, you know, got a real handle on the technique, the scope for you know, creating certain designs and repeating them is, you know, that's basically what you do, you know, as a turner. So you'll see people who have just started turning bowls will often turn lots of different shapes. Each time they turn a bowl, it looks slightly different to the last one they turn. It might be wider, narrower, because they haven't got the ability to kind of dictate what the wood does. They're more focused on various things, getting a nice finish, or just finishing the bowl before the day's done, you know. But with practice, yeah, I think definitely a lot of design choices and freedom to decide, for sure. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think
is that what you meant?
Also true, thinking back that, you know, when an Anglo-Saxon riddler would write a riddle, he or she might have an idea, but you do have the line form to meet and the alliteration demand to meet, and, you know, the beats to meet. So sometimes you get like 2/3 of the way through the riddle and it gets harder and harder sometimes, you know, because so you might decide to use a word and think, oh, this is not quite right. Oh, well, it's kind of metaphoric. It's almost right. You know, we'll use that one and we'll get through it. So I can see something like that happening, you know, with you when you're working with the wood.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And maybe that's why some of these riddles are so tricky in certain parts. Maybe like what you said just now, maybe some, you know, the person writing the riddle will choose a word that they're not completely happy with, but they'll kind of say, well, it will do. And then that word really causes problems for people later on, you know. It's interesting. Yeah, interesting. Thanks for the question.
Then that sort of implies that we will be evaluating the riddles and saying, is this an amateur riddle maker who has not yet got control of his wood carving techniques, or is this a master riddler who knew exactly what he was doing or she was doing, and that this is why the the riddle is the way it is. Yeah.
Well,
Interesting.
that's easier to do with the Latin riddles that have the answers. You can make that measurement, you know, but
Sure,
like
but
the
some
old
of the
English riddles don't have the answers. So how do we know?
Some of the Latin answers are wrong anyway. I've just stopped share. I wonder, Sharif, could you hold that bowl up again so that we catch it for the recording? I just wanted to catch it because we would have been on the slide when you were showing it, so the recording wouldn't have caught it, but it's beautiful.
Thank you. I just wonder if Adrian, if any of the wood turners here have got anything, any other thoughts to share on this riddle, or anything that's been discussed, Adrian or Tad, or do you think it's all been covered, or anything popped in your head that you might want to share?
Yeah, thanks, Sharif. This has been absolutely fascinating, and there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that pole turning is what the riddle was about. I like to think in that last sentence they're talking about the finished item leaving the lathe and being drunk from straight away, rather than waiting for it to dry and leak. But brilliant.
Yeah, I've been learning for maybe 3 years. I'm still learning. Sharif has taught me everything I know. And I'd concur with him. I'd say even more, as somebody who's learning all the time, that each time the piece of wood you're working with is a living thing, and each bowl blank, you try to make it the same, but it's slightly different and it reacts differently. I know Sharif's an expert and it doesn't react differently when he's doing it, but I'm learning, and it reacts slightly differently each time I'm trying to work with it. And maybe my technique's not as good as his, but it is a living, breathing thing that you're working with, this piece of wood, and each piece is slightly different, and you need to get into a rhythm. You get into a rhythm of working with the piece of wood. And one thing I learned last time I was with Sharif, just a couple of months ago, was to slow down and get into that rhythm, rather than trying to finish the piece. Just slow down and work with that rhythm and work with that piece of wood. And I think that's coming through here as well in this piece. I feel it is anyway.
Thank you, Tad.
Yeah, thank you. I'm conscious that we're at 4
Can I just say
o'clock.
something?
Yeah, go ahead.
All I was going to do was say, and then I promise I'll stop, was that was really fascinating, Tad. And we have other riddles that really engage with the living creatures of trees and wooden objects in that way. And I think that the riddlers writing these texts were very aware of the metaphorical potential of wood and trees. And we have multiple riddles that tell us things about it. This is our pole lathe one. I think we've got a consensus in the room, but there's so many more that engage with that metaphorical potential.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm happy to stay on a bit longer, but I'm conscious we're at our time now. So if we could all thank Sharif again, and perhaps stop recording, Megan, but let's thank Sharif first.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.